Welcome everyone from wherever you are and whichever time zone you're joining from today. I hope you all had a restful summer and that you're transitioning smoothly into the fall. Before we begin, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that I am a settler raised, living, and working on the traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe and in the territory covered by the Williams Treaties. Since many of us are joining from different parts of the world, I would invite you to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. As a second generation settler of Vietnamese descent, I believe it's important to acknowledge the land because I was often taught to be grateful about my family's resettlement here following their displacement, without learning about the historical and ongoing oppression of Indigenous peoples in Canada. I hope that today's conversation will prompt all of us to reflect on what it means for us to occupy the lands on which we are on and remind us of our ongoing responsibilities in honoring the treaties and supporting Indigenous sovereignty. Furthermore, I hope that this meeting collectively challenges us to rethink the ways in which we understand immigration, narratives, policies, and experiences, which are often within a colonial framework. Finally, it's important that these reflections lead us to taking the steps necessary for meaningful solidarity with Indigenous peoples and other marginalized groups affected by systemic oppression. So with that, my name is Michelle Nguyen, and I am a researcher at the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration located at X University. And today I am pleased to be chairing the first Migrant Futures webinar of the fall term on No Vaccine Against Hate, the implications of COVID-related anti-Asian racism on migration and integration, with our guests, Dr. Ethel Tangohan, Dr. Moo Chang Yan, and Dr. Diana Ye. This webinar is based on the Migrant Future series that is part of our Pandemic Borders blog space, co-edited by Cirque Migration and Open Democracy, where we look forward to a post-pandemic scenario and ask, what will international migration look like? What has the pandemic revealed about the structural challenges present across all regions of the world? What are the lessons we have learned, and what are the priorities moving forward? Each of our speakers were invited to, sorry, my dogs are barking in the background, but I will continue. I hope it's not too distracting for everyone. Each of our speakers were invited to write a blog piece, and we encourage you to check them out through the link in the chat after this webinar. So there are some housekeeping rules that I would like to go over before we jump in. Just so you can better understand the format of our webinar today, each speaker will share some remarks based on their blog contribution, and then we will have each of them react to each other's remarks. And then to conclude, we will head into an open Q&A discussion with questions from the audience. I will be selecting the questions and sharing them with the speakers. So due to the time, we are not taking those questions and comments verbally, but please do share them in the Zoom chat box. And finally, while this discussion is very important given the timeliness and relevance to our current realities, we also acknowledge that it is a sensitive topic, and we would like to remind attendees to be respectful and mindful in your engagement with the webinar today. So without further ado, I will introduce our topic and speakers. So Canada and the United Kingdom increasingly rely on international migration from Asia to boost their population and economic growth. In 2016, Statistics Canada noted that Asian countries made up 7 of the top 10 countries of birth of recent immigrants, including the Philippines, India, China, Iran, Pakistan, Syria, and South Korea. In the UK, East Asian and Southeast Asians are some of the ethnic groupings that are experiencing the fastest growth, many of whom are international students. Nonetheless, both countries have had long histories of exclusionary immigration policies and laws that have marginalized and continue to affect Asian migrant communities. As events unfolded during the pandemic, much attention was paid to the origins of COVID-19 and its variants, fueling the racializing and othering of those who are assumed to be of Asian descent. This has led to increasing acts of anti-Asian racism and xenophobia at both individual and systemic levels. According to the EliminateHate.org and Fight COVID Racism, there were 1,150 reported incidents of anti-Asian hate-motivated attacks between mid-March 2020 and the end of February 2021. In the UK, during the first week of the pandemic, there was a 300% increase in hate crime reports to police from British, Chinese, East, and Southeast Asians. These incidents raise questions on the impact of COVID and related racism on newcomers and Asian communities, what we even mean by quote unquote Asian, what have been the responses in advocating against it, and how does this affect future migration and integration? So it is now my honor to introduce our guest speakers. Dr. Ethel Tangohan is the Canada Research Chair in Canadian Migration Policy, Impacts, and Activism, and Associate Professor of Politics and Social Science at York University. Dr. Tangohan conducts research related to social movements, migrant activism, public policy, socially engaged research, intersectionality, Canadian and comparative politics. She is also actively involved in grassroots migrant organizations such as Gabriela Ontario and Migrant Canada. Her work has been published in academic journals such as the International Feminist Journal of Politics, Politics, Groups and Identities, and Canadian Ethnic Studies. From the UK, we have Dr. Diana Ye, who is Senior Lecturer in Sociology, Culture, and the Creative Industries, and Associate Dean of the School of Arts and Social Sciences at University of London. Diana's research interests lie in race, racism, migration, diaspora, youth and cultural politics, with a particular focus on constructions and contestations of British Chinese and East Asian identities. She is committed to working beyond academia and has presented her research on BBC Radio 4 at institutions such as the Wellcome Trust, National Portrait Gallery, and Tate Britain. Last but not least, we have Dr. Moo Chang Yan, who is a professor at the University of British Columbia School of Social Work. His research focuses on immigration policies, service needs of immigrants, racialized experience, and transnational movement of youth from immigrant families, and the role of place-based community organizations in social integration. As a social work scholar, he has studied and taught courses on cross-cultural and anti-racist practice in human services, and he has also co-edited the first Canadian textbook on working with immigrants and refugees for social work and human service practitioners. So after a very long intro, I would like to jump into the conversation. And first, I'd like to invite Dr. Tangohan to start us off with the question, how have Asian migrants been impacted by the pandemic, anti-Asian racism and xenophobia, and how have those experiences shaped their activism or responses towards the Canadian state?
Thank you so much, Michelle. And it is a tremendous privilege to be here speaking to all of you today. In the interest of ensuring that we have a free dialogue, I'm actually turning on my timer to make sure I speak at the allotted 5 minutes. When it comes to understanding my answer to the question and understanding how to process the fact that racialized working class communities have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic, I found myself since March 2020 reading the work of critical geographers. So I'm a political scientist, but I find that theories created by geographers have been more compelling. Specifically, to understand what's been going on, one of the thinkers I've been reading a lot is the critical geographer James Tyner, who came up with the concept Necro Capitalism. And according to this framework, Necro Capitalism sees that where people are positioned in the labor hierarchy determines their likelihood of experiencing death and physical vulnerability. And so just to kind of situate myself as well, a lot of my own work, engages deeply with migrant communities, specifically Asian migrant communities, specifically Filipino migrant communities, right? So, and I'm also, in terms of kind of my social locations, I'm also a Filipina immigrant whose family and community members have been impacted deeply by COVID. Right. And so one of the things I've been witnessing throughout the pandemic is I see that there are some communities that just don't feel the effects of COVID. But when it comes to my engagements with my community and the people I work with, COVID has become like a daily reality. Right. And so I can't kind of emphasize enough that class and race intersect here as well. In fact, as I speak, part of me is thinking about my family members back home in the Philippines who are also affected by COVID. In fact, my uncle is at the ICU right now in a hospital in the Philippines. He's a medical professional and he got affected by COVID here as well, right? So I'm sharing that to show that it's an embodied reality that a lot of us are facing. So to that end, when answering the question, how were Asian communities affected by COVID, I'd like to briefly talk about 3 projects that I'm involved in that engages with Asian communities. The first project is in partnership with AWARE and Migrant Alberta. And it is a project examining housing precariousness among Asian temporary foreign workers in Alberta, right? And one of our findings is that quite simply, a lot of temporary foreign workers, including caregivers, including low-skilled temporary foreign workers whose housing situations are tied to the employers, are experiencing heightened precarity during COVID, right? Some of the people that we've spoken to highlight how the fear of contagion discrimination affects their mobility around the cities that they live in, right? Especially since a lot of Asian bodies, visibly Asian bodies, are associated with COVID. It doesn't help as well that when it comes to public policy figures, such as Alberta's minister or health, like chief medical officer Dina Hinshaw, it doesn't help that one of her statements in the beginning of the pandemic, when thinking about the Cargill meat packing plant and how there were high rates of COVID among workers there, one of her public statements was that, well, when we think about COVID, let's consider how a lot of our workers are Filipino, and Filipinos culturally like to live in close quarters with each other, and culturally they have like a really strong work ethic, right? And for myself and my partners, when we unpack that, one of the things we say is that, is it really cultural, or why are we not looking at structural conditions, such as, for example, if workers don't have paid sick leave, they won't be able to pay for their bills, right? Is it really cultural when one of our study findings is that there is actually disproportionate racism targeted against racialized temporary foreign workers in the housing market in Edmonton? So, for instance, in order to get a rental unit, some landlords are asking for references to attest that you would be a good renter, right? And not just references from other provinces or even from from other countries. They want references in Alberta as well, right? So again, we see the intersection of race and class here as well. The second project I wanted to talk about is this participatory action research project in partnership with Gabriella Ontario and Migrant Resource Centre Canada. One of my brilliant co-investigators, Professor Connolly De Leon, is in the audience as well. And this project engages with Filipina care workers across Canada to understand their experiences during COVID. In terms of our study, we have engaged with 78 Filipino care workers. So these include living caregivers, personal support workers / healthcare aides, licensed nurses, registered practical nurses. And one of our findings, in fact, is that, there is a continuum of labor precarity that people are situated in, right? So in other words, registered nurses with citizenship, with access to a union are better protected compared to migrant care workers whose employment status and immigration status is tied to their employers as well, right? And another key finding we've had is that, again, their experiences of mobility is sharply curtailed during the pandemic, right? Some of our interviews have yielded a lot of emotional kind of responses from care workers who argue that even walking around in their scrubs lead to some members of the public kind of accusing them of spreading COVID, right? And we witness that when we look at the protests taking place in public hospitals in cities across Canada. But I think the salient point to emphasize as well, especially for this project, is that when we think about COVID vulnerabilities and the stresses of COVID when facing international migrants, they're not just thinking about their daily encounters with COVID within the nation state of Canada, but are also thinking about COVID and the realities of COVID in countries where their families are, because a lot of migrants' families are transnational, right? And so a lot of our respondents say, when I'm thinking about COVID and when you ask me how my family's faring, I'm thinking of failing public health systems in my home country where, people don't even have access to vaccines, right? So when it comes to kind of their lived realities, they also are thinking of the transnational as well. And finally, maybe we'll talk more about this during the Q&A. I also have a project in partnership with Professor John Paul Katungal at UBC, examining the experiences of Asian international students during COVID-19. We argue that international students, contrary to popular culture invocations of international students as being like crazy rich Asians, actually experienced tremendous stress during COVID, right? It's not just stresses born out of transitions to online learning, but it's also financial stresses, right? It's also stresses pertaining to lived experiences of racism. So some of our respondents are saying being visibly Asian has meant that, they have received weird looks from passersby to actual aggression, right? And this surprised us because our studies were done respectively in Vancouver and in Toronto, which are multicultural cities, and yet their experiences of racial aggression have increased spoken now engage in dialogue for these trends during the question and answer portion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ethel. I think we got a little laggy towards the end, but we caught your main messages. Thank you for sharing so much on the projects that are ongoing and also highlighting their precarity and the cultural and structural conditions that are impacting Asian migrants in Canada. And now I'd like to turn to the UK context and ask Diana, what are the responses to anti-Asian racism and xenophobia by the public and government in the UK? And what progress has been made to address it since the onset of the pandemic?
Okay, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. So what I wanted to draw attention to in my short talk today is the kind of dual but interlinked responses that's come out of COVID-19 anti-Asian racial violence from the state on the one hand, and then from Asian communities, or what we call here in the UK, East and Southeast Asian communities on the other. And then sort of using that to think about what kind of response we kind of might want instead. So just for listeners in Canada who might not be so familiar with the UK context, like Canada, the US and other countries around the world, the UK has seen this huge surge in racial violence against East and Southeast Asians due to the racialization of COVID-19. So police figures, despite underreporting, suggest that hate crimes against the Chinese tripled in the first 3 months of 2020. And as well as daily acts of physical and verbal violence on the streets, that's, public transport, workplaces, which have left East and Southeast Asians hospitalized or at least fearing leaving their houses. We've also seen this kind of massive impact upon businesses and livelihoods. There's also been this kind of huge surge in symbolic violence, particularly in the media and the social media, as well as kind of Ethel pointed out, as well as through the mouths of the political elite. So I guess that really brings me to the first point, which is about the woeful response of the state to this racial violence, which I think exemplifies a neglectful and punitive state. So first of all, the UK has been very slow to even acknowledge the racist attacks taking place and has barely registered the ways in which this kind of racial violence intersects with the wider disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on East and Southeast Asian communities due to existing racial inequalities. And I think here my talk overlaps with Ethel's. But instead, the focus by the state has been on hate crime, which is problematic in so many ways. I guess most obviously in often failing to provide a kind of sense of resolution or healing for the victim. But I also want to draw attention more widely to how the focus on hate crime is part of a wider technique of state power, which actually narrows understandings of racism and distracts from state perpetuation of racial violence. So in a context of anti-Asian racial violence, hate crime perpetuates these kind of racialized constructions of Asians, especially the Chinese, as a model minority. And then that's used to kind of demonstrate that the government is caring for deserving minorities, but then constructs these undeserving minorities. And it simultaneously kind of legitimizes the expansion of police powers that negatively and disproportionately affect migrant and racially minoritized groups, both within and beyond Asian communities. More widely, the hate crime framework also hides the structural dimensions of racism and diverts attention from a range of systemic inequalities pre-COVID that impact upon the ways in which Asians, especially vulnerable groups, including refugees, precarious migrants, those in poverty and frontline workers, experience COVID-19 more widely. So the fact that Filipinos in the NHS have experienced disproportionate levels of death of COVID, for example, as precarious frontline migrant workers. So the hate crime framework works to disavow the structural violence by the state and can therefore be seen as a kind of active, willful and targeted technique of state power. But this brings me to my second and last point, which is that the state refusal to protect and care for Asian communities has actually prompted a kind of radical transformation within these communities, producing what I would argue is a historically significant moment in racial consciousness and community organizing. So we've seen unprecedented levels of organizing, and as well as the kind of formation of new pan-Asian networks that have been so far dominated by a single ethnicity focus. So these are now bringing together a diversity of people across Asian ethnic groups, often for the first time. And if we look at the work of these groups, so they've responded to these kind of racist attacks through supporting victims to report hate crime, but have also offered a range of community-oriented support and healing projects that both respond to the racial violence, but also the wider COVID impact, and are attuned to the ways in which these kind of intersect. As well as the kind of important work they're doing in terms of community-led support, I kind of just wanted to add that, this new level of activity is significant in marking this new moment of Asian organising in the UK. So for us, there are these new attempts in intergenerational coalition building, which are kind of also sparking these new conversations around racism and its intersections with other oppressions. For the first time, really, we're kind of beginning to explore those questions relating to interethnic and interracial solidarity, community building, questions of anti-Blackness, the model minority status. All these kind of issues are beginning to be explored. So it is a historically significant moment, but I guess the challenges remain. The state's emphasis on hate crime does risk co-opting the work of these organisations. So I suppose, looking forward in terms of what we might wish for is that instead of this kind of hate crime framework, we need to kind of envision a kind of more radical new future, which is orientated towards this kind of more politics of care, where states are really held accountable for caring for all, regardless of status, rather than just being like this punitive arm, and where communities are not only centred in decision making, but also are themselves properly resourced and empowered to do that work. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana, for sharing the context on the UK and the movements that are ongoing now. So now that we've heard about the how anti-Asian racism has unfolded and impacted Asian communities in both Canada and the UK, and also how they reveal structural conditions that bring about disparities and inequalities that are experienced by those communities, how might this affect future migration? And Dr. Moo Chang Yan, I would like to ask you, how might COVID-19 related anti-Asian racism affect future migration and mobility of people from Asia to Western democracies such as Canada and the UK? And how would this affect perceptions of those countries by potential migrants?
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Well, I want to start with my own personal story. I moved to Canada in 1993, as you may know. During that period of time, there were altogether about 400,000 people from Hong Kong moved to Canada. And in the meantime, there were about 200,000 Hong Kong people moved to Australia, and some, about, I would say about 150,000 to New Zealand, and some to other places like UK and Singapore. So when we were deciding where to move, actually we knew very well that racism is not, is not untrue. Because our friends already moved to these countries have shared their story with us. Okay, even those days we are using letters and long distance phone call, which is very expensive. But as someone who wants to move to a new country, you probably to trying to find some way to get information. So we knew very well, and my wife and I decided to move to Canada instead of Australia because there were so many horrible stories about racism in Australia circulate around the Hong Kong community during that that period of time. And relatively, my friends in Canada, particularly in Toronto, told us, okay, this is a very peaceful country. So far we're okay. So that's why we moved to Canada. I also study in England. Honestly, being an international student myself, I will not choose UK as my destination because I know life will be very different there as someone who have to find a job in the job market. So what I want to point out is racism is not new, and to most migrants who decided to move somewhere else, okay, they will find ways to find out, okay, the social conditions of the countries they want to move to. And we know Canada is have not been a welcoming countries in the past. I think now it's much better, but still, there's lots of room to improve. So then I guess the question is why people still want to move to these countries like UK, Hong Kong, UK, Canada, and Australia. Like I think from a migration theory perspective, okay, there's always the push and pull factor. So there's some strong forces in many people's home country pushing them out. And this is the reality now we are facing. I'm not quite sure whether you're aware that at least from what I you heard from the news, okay, just in the last 12 months, there were 100,000 Hong Kong people moved to UK using the British national overseas passport. And I think Diana already, described, okay, the situation in UK and the racism against Chinese, but we're still talking about 100,000 Chinese from Hong Kong, okay, moved to UK. So then you can imagine, okay, there's some other reason why people have to move. Not to mention there's lots of refugees that basically have no choice. When your country is in war and you are facing persecution, you definitely still will have to find some place to go, right? So I think, this is what driving the international migration. There's some reason why people, some countries pull people into it and some country push people out from them. So Canada, to a certain extent, because of the modernization of our migration system in the 1967 by using the PON system, which does allow, okay, many people who have the skills to move. So I think that, allow the opportunity for people to consider if they are not happy with their home country conditions, they have to find out a place to move. If they can meet the conditions required by the Canadian migration system, then most likely they will choose to come to Canada. But having said that, I want to emphasize, it doesn't mean that, we should be complacent of, we are a good country, people would like to come, even though we have, some racism issue, but, it's not a big deal because, we still are very well one of the top countries people would choose. But I think this kind of complacence have to be very careful for, a couple of reasons. Number one, people can move to here, people can leave. So at least, we are talking about 10 years ago, there was a study saying that there were about 1 million Canadians residing outside Canada. And of course, nowadays, there's still a myth, okay, telling people that there are 300,000 Canadians living in Hong Kong. So in other words, people can move to Canada. And once they settle down, get the citizenship, they can still live. They can move to somewhere else. They can move back to their home country if the condition there improved, or they can move to some other countries to find a better, better opportunity. So in other words, okay, receiving immigrants is not, attracting immigrants to come is not that difficult, but maintaining immigrants in the society now is becoming more and more difficult. So not to mention about individual community, I think even the whole nations, okay, want to keep people here, okay, it's not as easy as what we thought. And then the other thing is, Canada, internationally, Canadian government tend to portray ourselves as the defender of human rights and social justice. So I think this is not, this is really, really, very bad, okay, for us to have this kind of racist situation happening in our own land when we are trying to fight for social justice and human rights in the world. Actually, the Chinese government did also, always use this as an excuse, okay, to attack Canadian government and justify, what they have been doing in their home country. So I think that's another thing. So, okay, if we want to live up to our, aspiration as the leader of human rights and social justice, okay, then our country have to fix this problem. And I guess, my main message here is people don't hesitate to move to a country all because of racism. Okay, people move to a country because of many reasons they have to consider, particularly if they cannot stay in their home country, then they have to find somewhere else to go. So that is driving our, our immigration policy in many countries and also immigration system in many countries. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for that realistic take of the question, whether it will affect future migration or not. And I agree with your argument that we can't stay complacent, especially given the narratives that the Canadian state pushes out about it being a welcoming country. And I'd also like to now point out to the fact that the news blog has been published, and I will share the link here if you'd like to check it out. And the following blogs from Ethel and Diana will be upcoming. So we will share that on our social media as well. And now that all the presenters have presented, I would like now to give the opportunity for each other to respond to the other presenters' remarks for about 10 minutes or so, depending on how the conversation goes. So would anyone like to start the remarks?
I certainly want to start with with a question to Diana.
Sure.
Like I mentioned, okay, at least now there I think there are 100,000 Hong Kong Chinese moved to UK. How do you see this new influx of Chinese? Okay, particularly, of course, no, many of them won't call themselves Chinese, including myself now. Okay, we call ourselves Hong Konger. But we look Chinese, sort of have a Chinese heritage. So how would that affect the situation?
When you say the situation, which specific situation?
The Asians racism issue, because it seems to, from the news, okay, I heard the Brits are quite welcoming to this new group of Hong Kong immigrants. So, but in the meantime, okay, there's lots of racism against Asians. So how are we going to reconcile this, this inconsistency?
Yeah, I think there is an inconsistency, and the government has actually responded in terms of creating specific, again, kind of expanding this issue around hate crime specifically to protect this particular group. So again, I mean, you have that protection on the one hand, but what the extent to which it actually protects those people on the streets is a completely different matter. And I think internally, it again sort of creates those kind of divisions, I suppose, within sort of British society in terms of the different racially minoritized groups, in terms of who becomes deserving and who becomes undeserving, and kind of pitches sort of battles between different ethnic groups, which I think is extremely divisive and I suppose highly problematic. So yeah, that's my kind of short answer to what to your question.
And I guess just to follow up on that, that's mainly the state's response, but I'm wondering how civil society and just the general public is now responding to migrants coming to the UK or Canada, just in response to maybe the lack of the state's welcoming.
I can talk about some of the advocacy movement's responses to that. And I see in the chat box that Dr. John Carlaw actually mentioned the Migrants' Rights Network. I think it's important to underscore that a lot of the movement to kind of institute policy changes and robust kind of measures to protect workers are being led by migrants themselves. So for instance, the Caregiver Action Center wrote a report saying behind closed doors, and they're part of the Migrants' Rights Network, that elucidated the experiences of migrant care workers, of whom the majority are racialized, right? And so I think, some of these civil society demands are scaling up. And that's why a lot of governments are kind of responding to that as well. A lot of the investigations when it comes to crowded housing facilities that a lot of seasonal agricultural workers have to contend with have also been driven by the advocacy work made by these migrant organizations. So I'll just kind of pop the link to Migrants' Rights Network in the chat box so people can look at their campaigns and maybe see what some of these groups are saying are needed in order to ensure that migrant workers' rights are protected, right, during the pandemic.
Thank you, Ethel. I'm wondering now if there are any other specific remarks to each other's presentations. If not, then we can just jump into the overall discussion questions. Thumbs up if we can move on then. Okay, great. So I would like to start with a more theoretical or conceptual question of, is there a relationship between individual versus systemic racism? And if so, could you share a concrete example that illuminates the relationship? And I guess I just want to open up with this question because we wanted to talk about this topic given the increasing incidence of racist or hate crimes. And I'm wondering how we can open dialogue about the relationships between these individual acts and more systemic oppression and structures.
I guess I could say a few words. If I understood the question rightly, I guess I was thinking really about this, the hate issue around hate crime that I've been talking a lot about. Scholars have pointed out that, it's a government-funded industry, and, this is this is an instance where it individualizes racism. So it constructs it as a kind of an expression of interpersonal hatreds between, of an individual racist or a kind of a bigot, and actually separates it and obscures it from state and institutional racism. Obviously, when we look at for example, what happened during the Brexit referendum, there was a kind of a massive spark in hate crimes across all, sort of affecting all minority groups. So that there is a link, I suppose, and between the wider political culture with the kind of discourses that were unleashed around the Brexit period, sort of really legitimizing and normalizing racial violence. So I guess that for me would be one way of illustrating the kind of the relationship.
I mean, it's all interconnected, right? Like you can't have a dividing line between structural racism and individual acts of racism. I do want to shout out Dr. Rita Damoon, who is in the audience. Like a lot of her work on intersectionality highlights the interconnections between all of these different scales, right? Like you can't just kind of separate the two. And I think concretely, when thinking about why is it, for instance, that migrant care workers who are racialized have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic? Well, we have to go back and have a look at immigration histories in Canada. And another one of my co-writers, partners, Professor Yasmin Abulaban is here as well. And one of her essential works highlights that, in 2002, during IRPA, we entrenched a Canadian model of immigration that kind of demarcates economic, humanitarian, and family, right? But even going beyond that, it's kind of structural values of neoliberalization and criminalization that has kind of infused the way policies are all connected, not from individual policies actually direct individual experiences.
Ethel, we are experiencing a little difficulty hearing the last part of it again, but
sorry, yeah, my internet's really bad. I just said you can't demarcate like individual versus structural. That's all I was saying.
Great.
I want to give an example of how the anti-Asians racism took place in Canada during the COVID-19. For many of you may remember, in early 2020, among the Chinese community, particularly, say, for example, in Richmond Hill, Markham in Toronto, and also Richmond in Vancouver, Chinese already started using masks everywhere. And actually, in February 2020, I just came back from Hong Kong after 5 months there. My friend already told me that don't go to Richmond, okay, it's dead, okay. All the restaurant was empty. Nobody ate out during that period of time. And if you went there to shop, okay, you saw everybody was on masks, okay, from the cashier to the shoppers, everybody was on masks. But the public health people keep telling people don't use masks. Mask is not useful. Mask cannot prevent COVID-19. So that message reinforced people when they look at the Chinese who use masks. And the fact is, on the other side of Pacific, there are many countries, Hong Kong, Taiwan, mainland China, many other, Singapore, many other countries, everybody was on masks. And the spread of the COVID-19 was totally controlled. So when the scientists telling us, okay, use mask is useless, when in real life data is showing that mask useful, and when the group of people who have been attributed as the source of the virus, using masks to prevent them, avoid the spread of the virus, and they have been all victimized by our public health systems, and the system basically reinforced that kind of racism. Okay. While this virus from China, so you guys, Chinese, are using masks. Okay, so you guys are guilty of spreading the virus. I think that kind of unconscious discourse, or we call this, institutional systemic, whatever we want to call it, basically generate, a major issue in the early phase of the anti-Asians racism, at least in Richmond and also in Toronto.
Michelle, can I intervene as well? Sorry, I'm not
Sure.
turning on my video for internet. I think it's also important to look at different ways, the different ways through which Asian immigrant communities have been racialized in Canada, right? In my project with Professor John Paul Katungal, one of our essential findings is that there's actually similarities between Asians being seen as contagious now compared to when Asians were being seen as contagious during SARS, right? Compared to histories of, that prompted the creation of the BC Exclusion Act, right? And so we need to kind of, I think our tasks here as researchers and as advocates and as community members is to thread together all of these instances of racialization and racism to see that this all falls, this is all part and parcel of the same kind of journey of racialization. And I will say that when it comes to the masking issue, a lot of studies have actually been emerging about how masks are kind of read as being Asian, right? And so some of our respondents in our Asian International Student Study, have shared how they would come into a store wearing masks, and store owners will be like, "Get out! You're scaring people." Even at the height of the pandemic, when masking mandates weren't pervasive as well. So masks have become seen as an extension of kind of Asian contagion as well. So a lot of these dynamics are historicized, and we need to kind of see the connections across these different moments as well.
Great. Thank you for clarifying and answering that question and illuminating that there's interconnectedness between the individual and systemic racism, and we have to address all levels of it. And I saw that there is a question that John Carla presented in the chat. He's saying, reading Moo's blog, there is a call for all levels of government and the general public need to step up to combat all forms of racism. I'm wondering what government measures you might like to see. And along with that question, I'd like to add that given the increasing attention to the importance of essential work and the vulnerability of racialized migrants at this time, what can employers do to support their employees in the workplace along with the government measures? So I'd like to open that up to all of you, and perhaps Moo can start and then can continue.
Well, that's a $1 million question. I think the government now is compared to, I would say 10 years ago, okay, became more progressive in terms of dealing with the racism issue. But, to me, many of those works are fragmented, I would say, not even fragmented. Sometimes it's hypocritical. See what happened in Quebec. If we look at this time, okay, the elections, no party except the Bloc Quebec was defending the Quebec interests. Nobody challenged what happened now in Quebec. They are they display a bad model of racism endorsed by the state. So I guess this is one thing, as a nation together, doesn't matter Anglophone, Francophone, or any other language, indigenous or people, we have to deal with this as a national issue. We cannot deal with it as a regional issue or provincial issue. So I think this is number one thing. Okay, the federal government should take the lead. Okay, to I would say to challenge Quebec, because if Quebec can do it, then why can't Alberta do it? Why can't BC do it? So I think all this need to be very carefully addressed. And in the meantime, is the government say they're doing anti-racism, but they don't put fund into doing anti-racism. So to me, again, okay, it's just an empty talk. We have a very good multiculturalism policy. We are the #1 country, first country ever have that, ad, okay? But how much resources we put in there? Couple $million a year, spread out for the whole country. So every single person even get 1 cent in doing something related to that, okay? I think this is another issue. So we, if we really want to make it as a policy issue, then we have to put resources, and also we have to learn from the multiculturalism policy, which basically have been criticized as a toothless, policy, because you cannot penalize, you cannot even take anyone to the court by violating that policy. So I think those need to be changed. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Moo. Diana or Ethel, would you like to add something?
I just had something very, very brief to share, which is that I think, when you're asking about what government measures would you like to combat all forms of racism, you know, that is a very difficult question because, you know, precisely at the moment, the UK government is refusing to acknowledge any kind of form of institutional structural racism in the UK. So the fact that they're unable or unwilling to even acknowledge its existence is a major problem. And, you know, that is, you know, let alone being able to think about the government measures we'd like to see. First of all, there needs to be an acknowledgement of the existence of you know, racism, structural racism, institutional systemic racism in the UK, which it is presently denying. Sorry.
Yeah, I put in on the chat, you know, links to policy briefs that stems out of the Filipina Care Workers and Photo Voice project that I'm engaged with. I do have a few concrete suggestions when it comes to government policies and how it can better understand the trends of racism and classism as they intersect during COVID-19. Number one, we should collect race-based data, right? In order to understand, you know, different challenges facing different communities, we need to kind of understand the scope of that. And so I think that's one kind of action item. The second action item, and this extends to all communities, but I can see this so clearly among racialized migrant communities, is the provision of paid sick leave, right? You know, a lot of personal support workers, healthcare aides, not just Filipina, feel compelled to go to work if there's no paid sick leave because they need to pay their bills, right? So having paid sick leave will actually also help make sure that COVID doesn't spread, but also will help guarantee their security and safety. And finally, I think, again, knowing my situatedness within migrant communities, specifically temporary foreign worker communities, I mean, one of the calls is, you know, providing landed status for all and also giving permanent residency to migrants and refugees who are already here, right? One of the things that the migrant care worker communities that we speak to keep asking is, you know, Canada needs our care work during COVID more than ever, right? Can we conceive of a Canada without the labor of these migrant care workers? And thus, they should be given access to Canadian citizenship right now. They are on the front lines and are actually more likely to get COVID. Personal support workers are more likely to get COVID compared to doctors and even nurses, right? So giving citizenship to these workers is one way to protect their rights as well.
Great, thank you, Ethel, and for all of these specific government measures that can be taken now that we can advocate for more of them in the public. And I think I want to highlight one example that I was thinking throughout the pandemic is there was this case where a health worker was being deported back to the Philippines, and the community actually gathered together and created a petition and really argued that this person was providing essential work to the community, and he, you know, his contributions should be recognized. And this is really actually inhumane to deport him back to the Philippines right now, where there's not a lot of vaccine access. And I think during that time, it really galvanized a lot of people to pay attention to the contributions of Filipino migrant workers and others during this time. And he eventually was able to stay back. And I think that really calls to the power of the community and advocating for migrant workers' rights and their right to stay in Canada. And so then I would also want to open the question to what are the opportunities for solidarity between different groups affected by hate crimes and racial violence during the pandemic, given all of the incidents across different racial groups and ethnic minorities during this time. So if anyone would like to start. So yeah, opportunities for solidarity across different groups. I think, Diana, you were speaking to this. Maybe if you would like to elaborate more on the projects that you're a part of.
Okay, sure. I'll just again say a little bit. I mean, I guess that there are great opportunities, of course, for creating these kind of interracial solidarities. And I think these conversations are beginning to happen in the UK, certainly amongst particular groups within the kind of like activist networks. I guess I also feel that there are challenges that we need to recognize and acknowledge, that it is that there are also sort of many groups within UK East and Southeast Asian communities who are less willing, I suppose, to recognize the privileges that come with a kind of model minority and stereotype and feel that they have gained from that kind of racialization and are perhaps less willing than we would like to get rid of that. As I mentioned, there are issues of sort of anti-blackness within our communities. I think one of the issues is, like, for example, you know, around the kind of hate crime forums, what I was hearing very much was this kind of use of hate crime forums. So the Met Police set up these hate crime forums to kind of connect with East and Southeast Asian communities and show that they were protecting us. But those forums were used by some community leaders to really construct themselves as, you know, deserving migrants against others undesirables. And they were calling for increasing policing, notably targeting specifically precarious migrants within East and Southeast Asian communities, as well as Black communities. So the opportunities are absolutely there. I think it's really, really exciting. If you look at sort of younger generation groups like DICON, they're beginning to think around sort of and influenced by sort of abolition trends and sort of thinking about those issues. But nonetheless, I guess that there are also challenges that need to be acknowledged.
I'm a little bit hesitant to go to that level of conversation because, you know, from what I experienced and also heard and in my study, okay, most people don't even know what racism is about. I'm talking about, you know, immigrants in general. Mind you, okay, many, like what I said, okay, many of them fled their country, okay, you know, decided to leave their country and then move to this country for some other reasons. Those reasons often preoccupied their everyday life, okay, and how they, you know, how they basically live the life, you know. So even in the anti-racism, you know, situation, I can assure you that many Chinese, okay, doesn't matter where they come from, okay, still don't think this is a problem to them. For instance, you know, in Vancouver, you know, if you live on the west side of the city, which is the affluent, you know, side of the city, you ask the Chinese living in those areas, have you experienced racism? The answer is no, right? Because they don't even mingle with people, right? They have their own house. But if you ask people somewhere, you know, in the downtown east side or close to the Chinatown area, okay, that's their everyday life. So I think, you know, educating people may be the first things we need to do before we talk about how to bring them together. If they don't know, they won't participate in anything. And then the other thing is we also have to really take into consideration the size of Canada and the diversity of Canada. Each city, each province have a very different experience. So if we think what happened in Toronto can apply to Vancouver, I live in Toronto for 9 years, and I can assure you that my experience of being a Chinese there and being a Chinese in Vancouver is very different. Not to mention, you know, the population, the demographic, you know, diversity, you know, in these two cities, and the dynamics are totally different. When we say the Black, you know, people have been discriminated and profiling in Toronto, actually in Vancouver or the Lower Mainland, I would say is the brown people. Other than, of course, no, in both places, okay, Indigenous people will be the number one. But, you know, in terms of visible minority, the brown people here always, you know, being picked by the police before even the Black people, all because of these gang things and the association, the preconceptions of, you know, what gangs, you know, the gang activities in BC. So I think those are something we, as, you know, someone who want to be activist or doing activist work, okay, against racism, we need to take all this into consideration. They can contextual differences. And I always remind people, don't use the American rhetoric and impose it in Canada and assuming that what happened in the state is exactly happening in Canada. Not necessary. I also lived, you know, taught and lived 2 years in San Francisco. And my experience, you know, I moved from Toronto to San Francisco. It's two different worlds. Two different worlds with two different, you know, historical background. So when I moved back to Canada again, okay, people keep telling me about what happened in the state, assuming those those things happening exactly the same in Canada. I was like, no, this is totally different. So I think all this need to be taken into consideration instead of thinking we can bring all people together and fight against racism. I guess I'm not that optimistic.
Can I interject, Michelle? Is that okay?
Yeah.
I know we only have 3 minutes left. Perhaps I just navigate different communities and different circles in comparison to our previous speaker. But in actual fact, I see the robustness of these coalitions. I see a lot of Asian activist groups working in solidarity with Indigenous communities and Black communities across Canada. It's not just a Toronto or a Vancouver thing. One of my first engagements with kind of Pan-Asian solidarity work and other Black and Indigenous communities we're also working with was in the aftermath of the publication of the McLean's article, asking whether universities have become too Asian, right? And I think, again, recognizing context-specific factors, recognizing generational factors, recognizing differences in class, right? Because I think class needs to be talked about, right? And where people are located in the labor hierarchy, I see such solidarity work happening. And it's not to negate the diversity within people's specific circumstances, but I really, really do think, calling on kind of like theorists such as Nancy Fraser, who's written on this, that people in the time of COVID are starting to see that we can't be complacent anymore, right? That the current system is not working for people. And I'm not just talking about the activists here. I'm talking about people who are experiencing the lived realities of COVID, care recipients in long-term care homes, right? I see coalitions being formed between patients and residents of long-term care homes, their families and workers. There are possibilities occurring everywhere I go. And I just think, we can't just assume, well, it's too hard to bring people together, educate them first. Well, do this simultaneously because that is happening on the ground.
Well, sorry, I want to rebut a little bit. I'm not saying those works are unimportant. That's not my point. Okay. The point is, if we want to make it as a bigger movement, just look at all these community organizations we are talking about. How many people are they really representing? I'm not saying their work is not important. I totally agree with Ethel. Okay, we need a parallel. But if we really want to generate a bigger social impact, okay, we need to bring more people into the movement. And in order to bring them into the movement, okay, they need to know what's going on, what is impacting on them. And I think this is something we need to take into consideration. It's easy to mingle together with like-minded people, but how to expand that circle, I think that's I would say something we need to really, really give more thought in order to make this movement bigger.
Thank you. I think all of those are valid points, and as someone who's like navigating her identity during this time and reacting to incidents, I'm constantly trying to juggle between the questions of where is the solidarity work happening and what hope can we gather from that, and also what are the challenges that we still need to tackle in order to bring more people into the discussion and generate change on a wider scale. And of course, we have to address it from all different levels and continue to educate people on racism and holding the government accountable to the measures that will better protect and better welcome newcomers to these countries. And I know that we are reaching 1 o'clock right now, but maybe just a really quick comment on what gives you hope in addressing these issues and how can we better advance community care, and then we will end there. And I would just like to thank everyone for your questions and the engaging comments in the comment section, and I hope that these thoughts will continue with you today. But yeah, just final comments on community care and what gives you hope.
I guess for me, very briefly, just what gives me hope is the kind of new mobilizations that are taking place in the UK, which I find really, really exciting. I think our the communities rather, are beginning to mobilize in really exciting new ways. I guess we need that more broadly. There's kind of a move towards this politics of care, I think, very much influenced by sort of the movement for Black Lives. But I think these are sort of expanding our political imagination in the UK in a way that we haven't seen before. So that gives me hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. And also just pointing to her event tomorrow, which is focusing on community care. I'm excited to attend. Ethel or Moo, would you like to add something?
I think for good, for bad, okay. What happened now is really pushing people to start thinking about, their experience. So like what I said, okay, if we think we want to, if we hope to expand the movement, then I think this is the moment, trying to really bring people into, or start pushing them to think about, what's going on to their life. Because many people just don't think about that, for a long time. So now it's real, the number is real, the experience is real. How can we make use of this? I think that's something we, I think we have the opportunity to do that. Yeah.
I do want to speak. I think honestly, this panel should be longer because I think me and Mew have a lot of disagreements here. But I think where I see hope are these actions, these community actions aren't being driven by the activist group, right? These are coming from communities themselves. The fact that coalitions are being built between recipients of care, family members who have residents in long-term care homes, care workers themselves, and are grouping together to try to fight for, to end privatization of long-term care homes, right? Better worker conditions. These are the moments of hope. These are generative and are coming from the grassroots. I think that this is a moment where people are actually experiencing, for better or worse, the impacts of COVID and understanding how care is essential and how we need to reverse our value, that profit isn't supposed to be a societal value, but rather caring for each other, caring for our communities. Climate change is another thing that people are starting to realize after what's happening in BC and forest fires, right? So this is the moment where these conversations are being planted, where people are trying to figure out, there has to be another system, there has to be another structure. And again, this includes people who are otherwise not political. So I think I take a lot of strength from the writings of people like Nancy Fraser. Harsha Walia's book was kind of mentioned in the chat box. These conversations are happening everywhere I go, and that's what gives me hope.
What a way to end the webinar today. Thank you so much for all the contributors to the blogs, Ethel, Diana, Moo. I look forward to seeing them published on the blog space and for everyone to tune in. And thank you for staying for another couple of minutes. And I hope that you take inspiration from this webinar and continue to have these discussions and practice community care. Thank you.